But what the research suggests is that even young people, and these are like tiny minority of the overall number of trans young people that we identify as trans, that identify themselves as trans, who decide, for example, after taking hormone blockers, and maybe even cross-sex hormones, that they actually feel somewhere else in the gender spectrum from where they started. In many cases, there isn't regret. There is just a sense that I've been on a journey figuring out where I'm situated. Were you too young to know you were a girl or a boy?
Oh, I hated the skin that I was in. I thought I was ugly. I thought I was unlovable. I couldn't leave my house without people staring at me or making rude remarks.
There is a sense, I think, or a message that many of us have received that it's okay to be a Jew as long as you're the right kind of Jew.
Just imagine what it would be like for you when you get out of prison after, 10 years in there for something you didn't do.
Approximately 6 or 7 policemen attacked me and put in my pocket a big quantity of drugs.
If we can choose how we live well, then do we not have the right to choose how we die well? And how do we do that with dignity?
There's never a moment where I am not in pain. It's exhausting. This bottom line is what it is.
I was born with a congenital limb difference. My arm, I have my elbow, but it was like underdeveloped from here out.
54% of those with disabilities are not working. If you're an employer, hire somebody with a disability. You won't regret it.
I've learned that us neurotypical people are the people who really need to learn from neurodiverse individuals. We are the aliens of this planet.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season will inspire you to empathize with people who are regularly marginalized and misunderstood. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show. Today on Purposeful Empathy, we're stepping into one of the most politically charged and emotionally complex issues of our time. And I'm going to start with a question. What if the loudest debates about transgender children and youth are actually drowning out the voices of the people who know them best, their families? In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Kimberley Manning, professor of political science and women's studies at Concordia University. With more than 15 years of research and advocacy, Kim firmly rejects the idea that gender diversity is a trend, a fad, or a social contagion. For over a decade, she has worked closely alongside parents of transgender and non-binary children, and what she shares is not only deeply researched and historically grounded, but shaped by lived experience. We talk about families navigating love and uncertainty and fierce protection, about gender, not as something new, but as historically plural and culturally diverse, about how misinformation is fueling anxiety, about how often invisible emotional labor parents often carry, about what real allyship looks like in schools and communities and at the dinner table, and about why support is one of the strongest predictors of young people's mental health and well-being. If you've ever found yourself wondering, what would change if we centered curiosity and empathy in a conversation that's designed to polarize us? This conversation is for you.
Welcome to the show, Kim.
Thank you, Anita.
It's great to have you. And we just chatted and caught up just a wee bit.
I know.
Great to see you. Great to see you. Before we get into sort of really the body of this conversation, I would love for you to share just a wee bit about yourself besides the bio. So we just get to know you as a human being. So whatever comes to mind, something quirky, maybe an interesting story.
Well, I'm the parent of 3 kids who are either teenagers or moving into their 20s. So I'm at this sort of interesting moment after having done really intensive parenting for now a little over 20 years. And one of the things that I've started to do now that I have a little bit more time or I'm making more time for, and that I'm making more time for is a return to painting, which I have not done since I was essentially a teenager with a brief interlude, maybe 10, 12 years ago. So just to note that that's a piece of my, I don't know, it's just giving me a lot of, I'm just finding it very restorative. Yeah.
Love it. What kind of painting?
Primarily, well, acrylic, oil. I do quite a bit of collage work and work with photographs as well. So yeah, a kind of mixed media, if you will. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
great. That's great. Little time, little extra time now that the
Yeah.
children are a bit older. I appreciate
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so I did a little research with regard to context for this conversation. So this is what I know to be factual based on what I've been able to find. You let me know whether or not you have different information. So national data from the Canadian Health Survey on children and youth show that just a little over 100,000 Canadians aged 15 or older identify as transgender, non-binary.
Mhm.
In the US, about 2.8 million people identify as transgender. About a third of those are between the ages of 13 and 17.
Mhm.
In the EU, I should say, 1.5 million identify as transgender. And globally, the transgender population is about 25 million people, which
Mhm.
is just a little shy of the Australian population, right? Just to give
Mhm.
sort of a global number. So all right, that's the lay of the land. Who are trans kids?
Um, so, first of all, I just want to again thank you for having me on today and to talk about what I feel like is a really critical topic, especially this moment in time. And I'd also just like to note that while that I have that I'm personally impacted by the issue. I myself am not trans as such. I'm cisgender, which means that I identify with the sex I was assigned at birth. Whereas trans people, generally speaking, do not identify with the sex that they were identified at birth, and by that, they may be trans, and in which they may undertake some form of social and or physical uh, transformation over any number of years, or non-binary, a term that you mentioned, which is a term that people use when they don't feel like they solidly fit with either gender, male or female, as we tend to ascribe it. Um, and for I've been involved in this work now for about 15 years, both in advocacy work as well as in research with respect to parents and trans kids. And 15 years ago, it was feeling like this was kind of a new phenomenon, right? Like suddenly there are these trans kids, there were media stories, what's going on? Is this, we haven't seen this before. I never knew a trans kid when I was growing up. What's going on? And I really want to, first of all, really underline that in many ways, it's our Western centric perspective that has occluded the capacity for us to either see or understand the fact that gender is a multiplicity, and that we all, cisgender, transgender, embody sort of multiplicities of gender, even if we may more strongly identify, for example, as male or female. And that there's just so much research that has documented, the fact that for as long as people have existed, as long as civilization in its various forms, civilizations in all parts of the world in which there have always been people who have played important roles as what we might call transgender or non-binary now, but for example, Indigenous peoples and in North America might refer to as two-spirit. And that's a term that doesn't necessarily align perfectly with transgender or non-binary, but may involve aspects of sexuality as well. But it's just to say that this is not a new phenomenon. And not only that, but even in our sort of very Western binary world, that even, research is showing now that even in like the 30s and 40s and 50s, there were young children whose parents were maybe a mother, often a mother, recognized and supported what was happening with their child and went to seek some kind of support. So so this is not new. What is new is that we have created new pathways for supporting new language, and increasingly as well, there are medical professionals who are working with families and working with children and in adolescents in particular, who may or may not want assistance in, for example, taking hormone blockers, for example, so that they don't undergo the puberty of the sex that they personally don't feel aligned with. So I would start off by just saying that is a longer sort of historical understanding of who trans kids are. I think is really important because it's not new. It's not a fad. And I think that there has been a lot of misunderstanding, in part generated by some news outlets that this is somehow being activist driven, or these children are being misled either by social media or by well-intentioned but ultimately misguided parents who are supporting these young people. Because the research is clear that young people who have support in living their identity in the way that they feel most comfortable, and again, that may or may not involve medical assistance and support, that their mental health outcomes are far, far greater, far better than those who are denied an ability to live in the world in congruence with their felt gender identity. And that's really key. And it's part of a larger, I think, piece of, if we talk about well-being, to think about this particular population, it's really as simple as folks just wanting to be able to live their lives.
Right, right. And I think it's so important that you started from this historical context. And I think the vision that I have as people are listening to this particular episode is that maybe they have a child who is transgender or questioning themselves, and so they're coming just for information. They want to understand their own feelings about things. Maybe it's someone who is questioning their identity and maybe finding a voice and language to explain how they're feeling. Maybe there's the friends and community that are listening. I'm certainly not imagining that the haters are listening, okay? Maybe they are, and they're going to write negative and nasty comments, but that doesn't matter. I just wonder, maybe there's somebody who has an earnest aperture to this conversation, but still isn't like fully there yet. And says, like, if it's always been there through all of time, but like, has it really been there at this great number? Like, it just feels like it's kind of like maybe it's a popular thing that's happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
What do you say to all of that?
Yeah. So, so I want to be, I think I'll give an analogy, um, if we think about second wave feminism in North America, really beginning in the late 1960s, early 1970s, right? In 1970, the year that I was born, um, a woman, my mother, for example, would have needed my dad's permission to get a credit card, right? Gender oppression from that perspective was deeply normalized in our society. And there's still many ways in which, of course, cisgender women are continue to experience various forms of discrimination and challenges. Gender is deeply real and is informs almost every part of our lives. And so for to say that how can this be, why is this suddenly happening? Again, it's to keep in mind what is that larger structure that is informing how we walk about and understand the world. From the very moment a baby is born, is it a boy or a girl, right? Like that's the first question that's asked, right? So it permeates our culture. So to actually make room for young people, for example, or old adults or elders to be able to articulate who they are and who they feel themselves to be. That's a huge, you have to get through all of that cultural noise, if you will, um, to make oneself heard and seen without being seen as transgressive. And this moment in which, of course, we're seeing a major backlash taking place both south of the border and here in Alberta and Saskatchewan. There is this, you have to get through a lot to really to be recognized. And so it's no wonder. And what we've seen over the last 10, 15 years is basically just the beginning of an opening, right? And that has been enough for some people to feel like they can walk through that door, right? And I'm yeah, so I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. But the second thing is there's a lot of some of the real worry and fear, which I understand is fear around, well, are they old enough to know who they are? Is one of the first questions. And second of all, well, what about supposed detransitioners? Because that's also been part of the public discourse. And so if I can, I'll just talk about those two different pieces. So first of all, they're too young to know. Where I think it's important for people to ask themselves, their own selves, is, were you too young to know you were a girl or a boy, right? Like, so that cisgender person who's like, well, what do you mean? Like, they're too young. Well, if you ask them to think about their own childhood, did you know who you felt to be? Um, and I think that's it's if they say, yeah, I always knew I was a boy, right? Well, great. Guess what? You hit the lottery, right? Because you then were growing up in an environment in that basic part of yourself was being recognized and understood, even if it might have been shaped in ways that maybe weren't entirely helpful. um, so I think that's one of the first pieces to keep in mind. Second, and related, this question about detransitioning. I think part of the challenge, even with, even when we think about as some scholars call it, a transnormative framework, which is to transition means you start in one with one designation of sex and you move to another designation of sex, right? And that's what it means to become transgender. But that binary understanding of gender, again, it does a disservice, and it because it's also not complete. It is one facet of what it means to be trans, for example, and what it means to just be a person walking around on the planet, let alone trans people. And so one of the things that we're seeing in the research now, particularly around young people, is that yes, especially adolescents may be exploring, or I feel I'm transmasculine for a period, and then I may decide actually I'm non-binary or I'm butch, and over time that may shift and change. But what the research suggests is that even young people, and these are like tiny minority of the overall number of trans young people that we identify as trans, that identify themselves as trans, who decide, for example, after taking hormone blockers, and maybe even cross-sex hormones, that they actually feel somewhere else in the gender spectrum from where they started. In many cases, there isn't regret. There is just a sense that I've been on a journey figuring out where I'm situated, where I feel most comfortable in the world. Again, I want to emphasize this is a tiny, tiny minority of the overall population. And there's now, I mean, decade-long study looking at hundreds of young trans people that have been going through these, going to clinics and getting various kinds of psychosocial and gender-affirming care. And it's a tiny number of those who may reconsider, but among the qualitative research that I've also seen with respect to those tiny numbers, there's not necessarily even regret. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think I'm going to circle back to sort of what I think is happening, or what I think I've heard is happening, especially in the Scandinavian countries where they're waiting a little bit longer for gender reassignment surgery. But I want to just ask one other question before we kind of get into there. What do you think are some of the common misunderstandings that people still have about trans children and their parents, and why those misconceptions persist?
So, I think that there is this idea that that kids may be seeing this on the internet or on social media, and that they're like attracted to this, oh, this is going to be the thing that makes me feel better as a teenager, right? Because we all know teenagers are uncomfortable and often miserable. But again, I just really, really, really want to emphasize that it's still very, very hard. Like, sure, you can be online and be connecting with people who are, queer or trans, and feel like, okay, this is where I feel like I fit and I feel really good here. But then you still have to walk around in the world, right? And everything about our world, or most things about our world, says, especially for trans non-binary folks, is how you are walking into the room. If it's, if that transness is in any way visible or notable, or in which, pronouns don't align with what the cisgender person is seeing, for example, it's tough. And it's an everyday, I don't want to use the word battle, but the obstacles, the challenges are extremely high. And with respect to parents who are on this journey, sometimes with younger children, sometimes with adolescents, sometimes with children who are in their 20s when they begin this journey. It's often terrifying because parents understand sometimes before, especially before a child might understand, that the world's not ready for them yet.
Mm.
And parents spend, and especially mothers, because as research clearly shows, it's primarily mothers who are clearing the way around young people, their children, and their trans child in particular, to try and make it safer for them to be in the world. And that emotional work, whether it's with physicians who don't get it, or with teachers or school officials who, insist that the child is going to have to carry a key around the school to access the one staff washroom, because they don't want them sharing a bathroom with cisgender kids, right? Like all the things, the multiple ways in which the kinds of discrimination, implicit and explicit, shows up, makes life so much harder. So the very idea that this is a trend that parents are jumping on because it's cool, it's just about, I mean, there are many gifts that come, and this is apparent in my own research. I'm involved in a team research project with over 60 parents of trans kids across the country. There are many gifts that come through the ways in which parents themselves are transformed, through doing their advocacy, through learning from their child about what it means to be more fully human in the world, what it means to be aware of and work at one's own biases, and not just around gender, but around all kinds of things. I mean, these parents are so inspirational, I must say, in their capacity to grow as human beings. So there are many gifts. But to say that this is something that a parent or child or young person is kind of wandering into because it's cool, is to completely not understand what the daily reality is.
So this is a podcast about empathy, and I wonder if there's a teen who's listening right now and wrestling with gender identity, and what would you like to share? What would you like them to know?
In response to this question, it would be like, first of all, where are you, right? Like what part of the country, or, I don't know if you have listeners from the US as well. And, this moment's scary. It's really scary. And it, each case is different. Like every young person is different in terms of what they need, and the kinds of support that may be available, again, depending on where they are in North America right now. If they're in a large Canadian city, there are lots of resources, lots of great organizations, so that even if that young person doesn't have the family support that they'd like, or doesn't think that they have the family support they'd like, there are lots of places to go. Maybe less in rural areas, but there are people, and part of the challenge is finding your people, right? Both peers, people your own age, and potentially teachers, and there are ways in which they will let themselves be known to you, and to the extent that you can, opening up, and if they let themselves know that they want to be supportive and helpful, they're a person who can help you on your journey, right? And I think that's the number one thing. It's not to be alone, to find friends or adults who you can talk to about this, again, even if they're not your parents. And, there's lots of great work underway, great initiatives whereby you can get all kinds of support through, even in Alberta, for example, Skipping Stones is an incredible organization doing work on the ground. So every province is going to have different capacities. Um, but I think the number one thing is to not stay alone, to find your people. And whether it's online, whether it's at school, um, and just finding the people who will see you for who you are.
Yeah, the invitation is to find a sense of belonging. I really appreciate that. And we're going to include in the show notes some links to organizations for anybody who's interested. What about, so many parents may feel pressure to understand quickly,
Mhm.
what's going on. I wonder if you could speak to like the role of empathy and listening
Mm.
to your child before trying to like
Mhm.
explain, fix, protect, like all the
Mhm.
natural parental instincts that come up.
That's really great, Anita. That's a great, great, great question. Um, so one of the things that the parent advocates that have been at this work for a while will say is follow the lead of your child,
Mm.
right? And by that, it's, if the child wants to go get some form of meet with a clinician or, explore what some options are, okay, then that's a pathway forward. They may just want to say, no, I just want you to know this thing about me. I'm not sure where I'm sitting with it yet, and I don't want to do anything yet, right? And so that requires a parent then to say, okay. And the other thing parent advocates will say, as well as, trans folks who are out there doing this work and have been doing this work for a long time, um, then the parent needs to go do their research, right? So by that it means reading often, lots of reading, maybe watching some documentaries, finding what the resources are in their town or in their city. Find those peer support groups. The peer support groups, and there are lots online as well for parents, are phenomenal. Um, but the thing is it's not only listening to your child when they're ready to speak, but it's also being careful not to lean too hard on your child to educate you about what this all means,
Mm.
because that's not their job. They're the kid.
Mhm, mhm,
Um, and B, they might not know, or even like, you know, that is like that's for you as the parent to walk into that work.
mm,
Now, again, I want to be careful, and as a feminist in particular, I'm very attuned to the fact that when we can talk about parents, but the vast majority of situations, we're talking about moms, right? And I really want to be clear that, um, when I say parents, I would like to see more fathers leaning into this work, because that labor cannot just rest. Again, we're continuing another form of gender normativity when we say it's the moms that have to go out there that need to know how to listen to their kid, first of all, and then to go out there and do the things that the kid has identified needs to be done, in terms of their own, you know, and then the mother, doing all the self-education and then being the one who comes back if they're in a heterosexual partnership to educate the dad, right? So I just want to be a little bit mindful of that, or a lot mindful of that very real emotional labor that it is often mothers that take on.
I love
And
that this is coming up, and I know I kind of know what the answer may sound like, but I would love for you to articulate it. Why do you suppose it's harder for men to engage in this work, or fathers?
yeah, I mean, yeah, again, when we started this conversation, I was talking about gender normativity and why it's difficult for, why we're seeing this upsurge in young people. Which, and I should say that upsurge is leveling off now. It's like now that there's more space, right? Yeah, so it's not like it just goes up and up and up forever, right? There is a leveling off that's taking place. And so I just want to make that note. But for dads, men, heterosexual, cisgender men, um, who've been, even for feminist heterosexual cisgender men, this kind of work of, having a young child who you think of as your little man, only wanting to wear princess dresses and twirl around, can be highly uncomfortable because it goes against everything that
Society is taught.
yeah. And again, this is a huge opportunity for growth. I mean, being a parent is an incredible opportunity to grow as a human being. And as I've said already, parents of trans kids, it's no exception. They're no exception. And in fact, this offers a path for like really learning about your own self and how you fit in the world and your own upbringing and how you can now make sense of it in a new way. Um, but I think that again, women, cisgender, straight women, um, have more capacity for doing that than do men.
Yeah, maybe there's a little bit more leeway also, right?
Yeah.
Not only skill, but leeway. You remind me of a conversation that I had with a father who is raising an autistic child and came to the same conclusion that once there was an embrace of a reality and a curiosity that was earnest, all of a sudden lessons came through where his son was teaching him about non-judgment in a way that allowed him to heal parts of himself. So
Yeah.
I just pick up on these threads here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tremendous, it's, as I say, it is a daily challenge and an extraordinary gift as well.
Mm. Staying with the parents for just another moment, they're often navigating love for their child while facing social resistance or coming up against policies and entire institutions that reject the entire notion of transgender, right? Like you said, we're taping this in December of 2025. What do you want to tell parents about holding empathy for your child and self-empathy while also engaging with people or systems that may not yet understand?
Mm-hmm. So, you talked about that, or I think this actually came up before we started taping, but notion of attachment parenting, and this is something I've thought about a lot, and or at least um, that ability to really listen and try to understand what your child is bringing to you, right? And that capacity to open space, to hear, to be present to where your child or young person is at, that deep curiosity, if you will, that spaciousness, uh, is really key. Um, but I also, yeah, so I will say that is absolutely key. And I also, for those parents who perhaps are in communities where there's a great deal of hostility, or they're living in parts of North America right now where the policy, institutional infrastructure in Alberta right now, where we're going to look at an exodus of families. I'm reading online right now about parents who've already been. There are many parents who've already up and left the United States, but there's going to be a massive exodus now, I think. For those who can afford to leave, will be trying to leave because of the Trump administration's decision in just the last few days that they're going to basically cut off money for hospitals who are providing gender affirming care to young people. But I want to say that it's a marathon, especially for parents of young people or even younger teenagers. You're looking at years of your life in which you are in and out of potentially doing frontline work with your kid, and maybe if this is part of your where you feel like you can and want to make contributions, you're out there also working in organizations, maybe providing peer support for other parents, maybe lobbying, maybe trying to change laws, maybe doing these other things. But it is a marathon, right? And from that perspective, it is absolutely crucial that the parents who are doing this work find ways to restore their own sense of capacity, that they step back when needed, not necessarily from being there for your kid, but maybe those more public facing work, for example, or that there are ways in which I also think of this work as, you've got a baton and you're running a first leg of a race, and then you pass it to the next person who runs, and then and so there's some of that element in it too, because it can be exhausting and draining, and social media alone, engaging with the folks out there. I've read, again, through these interviews that we've been doing with parents across the country. Some parents will say, yeah, I'm here for the social media engagements, and this is how I do it, and I address the person if they've posted something that I find transphobic or alarming or misguided in some way. And, there are times when it works, and then there are times when the person is not responsive. And so then I, make a decision that I'm going to either end that online friendship, or however it is they negotiate that. But what I bring up that example because some people can do that and do that easily for long periods of time. Other people, it absolutely depletes them, and it puts them into a kind of a stress response where you're abiding in that stress response for weeks, months, years on end. And our bodies can't sustain that. Our well-being can't sustain that sense that we're in a constant state of emergency, as some parents and families and kids are right now, right? And it may be at certain times where it just needs to be, okay, how are we going to get through these next few months? What do I need to do? What do I need my partner to do? What do I need my close family members and friends to do? So that to help me, so I can continue to help my kid, my other kids, because there are often other children, cisgender children, who also need the attention and support and guidance and, all of the pieces as well. So, I mean, it's oft said that you can't fill up other people's cups if your cup isn't also full. And so that self-empathy, I think, is crucial, and especially right now. And for as far as convincing others goes, I mean, I think you're right in the context of your podcasts. We're not going to have folks who are really of the mind, Trump's passing legislation, for example, is very much coming out of a worldview that to provide gender affirming care to children is actually a form of abuse, right? This conversation's not going to change that, right? A conversation around empathy, they are being empathetic in their own, like I was thinking about this before coming on the show, like that for them is that's what it means to be caring for these young kids, is that they see them as at risk, right? Um, but I think for the folks out there who don't understand, who need to ask questions, who want to understand, for those parents who have the time and capacity for it, great, right? Because sometimes those conversations can be you do it in 10 minutes, the other person gets it, move on. Sometimes it takes weeks and months, right? Before that. And you may not have that capacity, right? You may not, and it may be a close loved one. It may be a mother, your own mother. It might be a cousin or a sibling, a coworker. And you may just not be down for an argument about it every time you see them.
Right.
And then that requires okay, the most empathetic thing I can do for my child and myself and my inner family right now is to take a break, to,
Mm-hmm.
to make other decisions,
Now, I
Yeah.
promised to ask a question about allyship and what real support looks like, but just while you were talking, one other question surfaced for me that I'd love to ask, and I might be asking, uninformed, and help me understand if I'm even asking a question that could be helpful in some way. I wonder if there are parents who, don't struggle with this conceptually,
Yeah.
you know, um,
Absolutely.
but then might be struggling emotionally and maybe feel guilty that they're struggling emotionally. I don't know if like there may be a loss, a felt loss. Like I think about the father, like, oh, my little champ, but that's different than like I thought I had a daughter and now uh, like I'm losing my daughter. I don't know
Mhm.
whether or not there's anything to be said about that.
So the question is, do some parents experience grief? Um, and I guess, and do some parents, for whom this is not a surprise or not a strange or bewildering experience? First of all, I want to say there are parents out there for whom this is not a bewildering experience. Um, they may be queer, for example, themselves, or have family members or friends who are trans non-binary, and for whom they see the challenge because they understand the world as it's currently constituted, but for whom this is not a mind-boggling moment. Okay. So I really want to emphasize that. Um, and then there are parents who experience what you are talking about as grief. And that's been a complicated and challenging issue, I think, because for some people, well, what are you grieving? You still have your child. What like, come on, Um, but um, generally, if there is a sense of grief, and this is where parent support groups can be very helpful. If there is a sense of grief, it passes fairly quickly because once you get exposed to other parents and families who are living full and wonderful lives and their kids are still their kids, and what your imagination had about your future children, I mean, that's part of the lesson of parenting. Whatever it is you think your kids are going to be or do or whatever one day, that's not you to say, right? So it's part of a larger understanding of, I think what it means to parent um, fully realized individuals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And again, it's not to say that grief isn't a valid feeling, because again, we are raised in this binary world where we come to expect, oh, I've had a baby, girl, and we're gonna do this. They're gonna learn how to sew just like my mom taught me how to sew, and we're gonna, and
Mm, mm, mm.
but you could have a girl who, feels like they're a girl and doesn't want anything to do with sewing, right? Like, no thanks, I want to go throw the ball around, or play hoops or whatever, And so again, it's coming back to that fuller understanding of who young people are. Again, it's not that children don't need guidance and support and our care and all of those pieces, like all of that you're still their parent. But being a parent doesn't mean you get to determine who the child fundamentally is.
Right.
So, yeah. If I can, Anita, I would like to, because you'd mentioned something a few questions ago about Nordic countries choosing to do maybe waiting longer. It's actually the UK right now that has, I mean, yes, they're Nordic countries, yes, but
So Kimberly, yes, because we're obviously intuiting that we both want to get there, and then I want to talk about
okay.
allyship. I want to ask two questions. One
Yeah.
is there seems to be this narrative about some countries that were, trailblazers in this space that are kind of like pulling back a little bit. That's sort of a sense that I have. And then there's also a dialogue among people who may not be transphobic, um, and may not have a personal experience in their life within their own family, but are open-hearted and open-minded to it, but draw a line in the sand when it comes to sports. Those seem to be like two narratives that are out there in this conversation right now. I wonder if you could speak to both.
So, first of all, I think I want to speak to in particular to the UK right now, in the wake of a report called the Cass report. The UK Health Services is no longer providing gender affirming care for young people under 16. And this has been a little bit of a like, well, we want to wait and make sure that the young person, that they really mean business, right? And again, keeping in mind all of the things I've already said about, well, actually, this is something that the vast majority of young people definitively benefit from. Like, there's just no question in the research. The Cass report has been resoundingly condemned by researchers for its lack of engagement with the better studies that have been done. And subsequent research has made that even clear, published research that it is that they are risking the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of young people right now by barring gender affirming care for those under 16. So a wait and see approach, I would argue, is not only misguided, it's extremely dangerous. Because you're literally putting lives at risk. The rates of suicidality drop significantly when young people who are asking for gender affirming care receive it. Okay, that and parental support is another extremely most important protective factor for young people. So those two pieces, parental support, gender affirming care when asked for, full stop. Yeah, and my hope is that the Cass report will be overturned. But we are in a moment when that is happening, when we see stuff happening south of the border, right? In Alberta, we're in a moment where there is a backlash that's taking place that is not evidence-based. Okay, it's not what all of the pediatric organizations, the full medical establishment is behind gender affirming care. Full stop. It's where the research is, it's where the the clinicians are, it's solid. With respect to sports, I think it's really, really critical to, first of all, think about what we're talking about and who we're trying to protect, right? A lot of the discourse has circulated around young cisgender women who are on sports teams and they're getting outplayed or outrun or beat by trans girls who, because of their physiology, are just able to outperform these cisgender female athletes. So first of all, I want to say, like, the couple of examples that there are out there, these are not Olympic contenders. These are young people who are, playing sports, and for whom this has become an issue of injustice. But I want to reframe things a little bit on a couple of levels. So the folks who are most loud about this, often men, but cisgender men, some women, conservatives often, though there are liberals who have expressed their concern about this issue. And they, my question then is, okay, I hear that you're really concerned. I hear that you're really concerned about women in sports. So where's the money going into athletic programs for women at universities? I think that there's a real disconnect between, we're going to protect cisgender teenagers, girls, from being outplayed, right, by these trans women, right? And from that perspective, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, as it's being rolled out in places like Alberta, for example, means that cisgender teenagers, women, young girls, are going to be subject to verification, right? So they're like, somebody's going to have to physically decide that they are in fact a girl. Can you imagine how traumatizing that's going to be for young women to have to undergo that? So that's the second thing. But the third thing to consider, especially for young people, and again, the focus is never on trans boys playing sports. The focus is always on trans girls playing sports. Those trans girls that have gone through hormone blockers and have received hormone therapy, gender affirming hormones, their capacities to play sports, their physical capacities, are going to be on par with cisgender girls. They are going to have zero advantage. In fact, they may even be outplayed because their bodies have not grown in the same way that, so the debate itself is so skewed, is so inattentive to questions of gender more in a fuller frame, that suddenly it seems, why are you even, when I was 10, starting when I was 10, I was living in California, and it was when Title X came in, and there weren't, I wanted to play soccer. There wasn't a girls' team. So I was allowed. I played with the boys. It was a boys and girls team. So for grades 6 and 7, and often I would end up being the only girl on the team. Now, was I outplayed by some of the guys? Sure. But I got to play. And for me, it wasn't about It was just being out there playing, right? And so I think that we're really missing the boat by making this a fundamental issue of fairness. I think by focusing on this, we are actually getting a lot more things there are a lot more things unjust than this with respect to gender.
Glad I asked. Glad I asked. Kim, I know you've been very generous with your time. I have two more questions. So let's get to this important question about how society at large and how, friends and family and community can support the trans community. How can we be allies? What does real support look like? What would you like to say to that?
So, I mean, I think that we have a lot of work to do. I've been participating on a subcommittee on transphobia at Concordia University, sort of looking at ways in which our own institution can be more affirming with respect to gender. And we've come up with a list of recommendations. And, I think we as institutions, there are lots of ways, whether it's bathrooms, whether it's, you know, making sure our healthcare policies are good and providing the gender affirming services that people need. All of these sort of more institutional things. We have a lot of work to do. Couple of things, though, I would say, please don't vote for anybody that is throwing trans people under the bus. That's just a starting point. Do not vote for them, and make it clear, if you feel like you are able, on social media, if you have capacity, if you see something that is transphobic or is, supporting a leader who's publicly transphobic, make it clear that this is not okay, that this is hurting people directly, and it's leading to dire outcomes for this very vulnerable population. Incredibly resilient, incredibly strong, all of the creative, these are incredible human beings, but they've become the punching bag for far too many, especially conservative commentators and politicians right now. Don't let that stand. That's number one. And second of all, be a friend, be a good family member. If you're going to have people over and you've got somebody who's recently come out, you talk with the person first. How is it you want to be addressed? What would could I, for example, email everybody in advance and let them know this is what's what? You talk with them, find out what they're most comfortable with, and then you do that. You create that space in your home, if you're having the family gathering. I saw a thing on social media recently where somebody was whose parents were consistently misgendering. I can't remember if it was their niece or nephew, or nibbling, as some people would say. And brought an air horn to the family dinner. And every time that young person was misgendered, they again, not everybody's going to want that kind of support, and so it's really important to check out with the person. But, just simply saying, hey, what can I do? Am I, and here's some options that I've thought about. Maybe those aren't good ones, but here's some things I can do. Yeah, and just trying to respect people's pronouns and their names, and not be inquisitive in unhelpful ways, like not asking about, have you had the surgery yet? Because, by the way, a lot of trans people, maybe even half of trans folks, don't have a gender physical modifications of, or may only have some, or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's not your business, right? So, be curious, yes, about how I can help you feel safe and supported, or safer and supported. But also be respectful of people's personal privacy.
And I also heard many times, I heard my voice say gender reassignment surgery, but I've heard you many times throughout using gender affirming care. And even those kind of words
Yeah,
language have meaning. So I've picked that
yeah,
up. Yeah.
yeah.
That.
And again, I just want to note too that I consider myself somebody who aspires to be an ally, but I am cis, right? And so, were you to have, a trans person on the show, and I would, encourage you to do that. And I've got lots of great folks who can also speak to that lived reality right now, and they're going to have different perspectives among them too. But just to say that my vision is also incomplete, right? And it's shaped by my own experience as a cis person who has many trans folks in her life who she loves.
Fair enough. Heard you loud and clear. So the last question, which I ask all of my guests, regardless of the topic, is if you can think of a time in your personal life, a specific moment, when you were on the receiving end of empathy, what that looked like and what that meant for you.
Mhm. Yes, it was 2012. No, 2011. No, 2012. Sorry, it doesn't really matter. I had just finished organizing a major conference and then flown with my three kids to a wedding. Had arrived very ill and proceeded to get much more sick. I was exhausted, talking about, you know, advocacy and burnout. It's real. And, I had a baby and two young kids, plus was trying to do all of this other work. And anyway, long story short, I was on the flight with the kids between Chicago and Montreal, and one of my kids had been jumping around and accidentally whipped her head back, and my lip got cut, right? So I'm holding a baby, my bleeding, waiting for this flight from Chicago to Montreal. Was sitting in a wheelchair because I basically had bronchitis, borderline pneumonia. I was a mess. And this woman was sitting in the departure area, and she came up to me and said, can I help you? And I was still like, no, 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 I'm okay. We'll make it work. And she said, no, I insist. She said, I'm a mom of three kids. I'm gonna help you get home. And she did. She got her seats rearranged, and one of my kids sat next to her, ended up falling asleep in her lap. She basically got us into Montreal, and then one of my other kids promptly threw up on the floor. Like it was just, and then our car seat didn't arrive. And then it was like but she stuck with us until like 2 in the morning, until my partner showed up at the airport. And she just was this stranger um, who had just on her own was coming back from a wedding herself for the first time, leaving her three kids, and she just showed up for me in a way that was um, selfless isn't the right word, connected way, like just stepped right up and in to the moment. And yeah, um, we we we've stayed in touch. I mean, not closely, but we did forge a friendship following. And I will be forever grateful. I call her my airplane angel.
Out to the airplane angel. Oh, what a beautiful story. I feel all the feels. I mean, I love this question so much because I never know what I'm going to hear. Inevitably, the person who shares the story feels the feels. I feel them across the Zoom call. I know people listening and watching are feeling the feels. And it's just a reminder that when we can extend empathy to someone else, it is so beautiful. It is so meaningful. It is so reciprocal. I mean, I'm sure she didn't feel like an airplane angel, but I'm sure she felt connected.
Yeah.
And that was a beautiful thing for her too. And we can just all do that. And so taping this on December 19th as we're heading into the holidays and the birth of a new year, let's just turn up the volume of empathy in our lives.
Thank you, Anita. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing. Really, really admire it.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time before the season. Thank you for being here, Kimberly. We're going to include lots of information in the show notes. Thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
If you know someone who would benefit from this episode, please share it with them now. Post the link to your socials, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.